Hello, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much, as always, for joining. I'll follow the normal format of muting everyone, but obviously, please feel free to use the chat or regular function just to unmute yourselves. So we're looking at the topic of Das Torah and the extent and parameters of rabbinic authority. And we looked last week at the who is invested with this authority, whether this is something only invested in the Sanhedrin, or whether it's something that applies across the generations. We saw the different language of the Rambam and the Chinuch, and then we saw the Rambam, who takes a middle position, perhaps, in which he says that the Sanhedrin are the ones invested with the full extent of rabbinic authority, as per the pasuk, really. The pasuk that we started off our whole discussion with in Devarim speaks about going to the Sanhedrin, to the court that sits in the place of the Mikdash, and this refers to those who sit in the Mokum HaMikdash. So says the pasuk, and B'Mokum Asher Yivcha Hashem, the place which Hashem will choose. And the Ramban understands this to mean to the Sanhedrin HaGadol, the great Sanhedrin. Nonetheless, the Ramban says that a court which is accepted by the whole of the Jewish people achieves similar central authority. And we looked at the history of this idea, the idea that Semicha could be restored based upon agreement of all the Chachamim and the debate around the authority of the Gedolim. So this clearly doesn't apply nowadays. There isn't a central accepted authority, though it's possible that this is the origin of rabbinic authority over any particular community. So a community that accepts upon itself rabbinic authority, there would be a concept of Mora de Asra, the rabbinic authority over the community, which is based upon localized acceptance, which the Rambam acknowledges, and this enters certainly into halachic literature. So there's no doubt about localized halachic authority based upon local acceptance, but central authority that's a requirement upon everyone is only if the Sanhedrin are Gadol, or if the whole of Klal Yisrael accepts a particular rabbinic authority. I want to move on though now to discuss what is the extent of rabbinic authority in terms of the realms that it covers. What is included in this rabbinic authority? Is it only halacha? Is it also minhag? And what about matters which aren't connected to halacha whatsoever? Don't forget, we saw right at the beginning of our discussion, when we were talking about the concept of Das Torah, and we were trying to define this sort of messy term, which means lots of different things, and we were speaking about it as perhaps even a spectrum of different ideas. We saw the language of the Chazon Ish, in which the Chazon Ish says that the division of Torah between Issa and Heta, between that which is Mutter and that which is Asa, and guidance in everyday life, and the idea that one should only subscribe to rabbinic authority of Issa v'Heta, that which is allowed and that which isn't allowed, and leave everything else to one's own free choice. He says this isn't correct. All areas of life are covered by rabbinic authority. So let's have a look at the sources and see what we can work out from this. Now I want to turn again to the Rambam that we've looked at so many times, and just point out one more line in the Rambam in order to start off with the Rambam's position on this. And this is the Rambam that we saw repeatedly in Hilchos Mamrim, in the first chapter of Mamrim, where the Rambam discusses Sanhedrin authority, central court authority, and the rebellious sage, the Dayan who refuses to accept the Sanhedrin's authority. And we saw already that the Rambam, Maimonides, extends this authority beyond the Ramban, for example. So whilst the Ramban only says this applies to interpretation of Torah, the Rambam says it even applies to innovation of new rabbinic legislation. And he includes in rabbinic legislation either direct legislation or minhag, practices that are instituted, and takonos, decrees. I'm not going to go into the various types of drabonons that exist. But then the Rambam finishes off, and he says, ha'ova al echad mehem, so I'll just highlight this on the screen. V'ha'ova al echad mehem, let me see if I can just highlight the words. V'ha'ova al echad mehem, someone who transgresses any of these rabbinic legislations, over belusasi, transgresses a negative commandment. And now he brings our pasuk in Devarim Yodain that we've seen so many times. Harihu omer al pi Torah asher yerucha. The pasuk says that we should listen to the Torah which we are commanded in. Now, what does the Torah asher yerucha mean? The Torah that they teach us. So the Rambam doesn't understand this to mean interpretation. The Rambam understands this to mean innovation. These are the new rules that the sages make in order to strengthen the faith and perfect the world. So here we have a Rambam that seems to be granting authority to rabbinic sages, not just not just to strengthen the faith, but also to perfect the world, to sort out matters that need addressing in the world. So this is what the Rambam says. Now, there's 2 points to make about this. The first thing is that this is probably in line with the general thinking of the Rambam. Maybe in another series where we look at philosophical questions in Judaism, we can ask ourselves, what is Torah? What do we mean by Torah? And one of the core questions when we ask what is Torah is it just a spiritual guide to life, or is it also a guide to a life well lived in almost the material sense? Just a healthy and positive way to live. There's a lot of discussion around this. For example, would it be a legitimate explanation of kashrus to say that this is to do with health effects or not? So this is a discussion around what Torah is, and it impacts a little bit on our discussion because the extent of rabbinic authority, if we understand the Torah is giving the Rabbanon authority over the extent of what the issues that Torah deals with, then depending how we define the realm of Torah will certainly impact upon this. Now, I don't want to go into that into too much detail, other than to say the Rambam definitely has a broader perspective of Torah, in which he sees Torah as not just being a spiritual guide to life, but also being a guide to how to flourish intellectually and emotionally and psychologically and socially and in the whole realm of human existence. The Rambam doesn't really necessarily even see a clear-cut division between, for example, spiritual health and psychological health. I mean, clearly you can be psychologically healthy and spiritually unhealthy, but the Rambam sees them as merging more into each other than perhaps we would normally think. And therefore this letakin ha'olam, to fix up the world, not just the chazik hadas, not just to strengthen the dat, the faith, is in line with the Rambam's thinking. So this is the first point to say, that it is true and correct that the Rambam sees the perfection of the world, tikkun olam, as being part of a broad pattern of what Torah is about. Many mitzvahs in the Torah are to regulate society and to ensure that the world functions well according to the Rambam. Having said that, let's not forget that the Rambam views this authority as invested only in the central authority of the Jewish people, which is either the Sanhedrin on the Beis HaMikdash or the central authority accepted by everyone. So in a sense, this is obviously part of the role of central government. So if the whole of Klal Yisrael as a nation accept central authority, or the Sanhedrin is given this at the time of the Beis HaMikdash when it's sitting there in its chamber, the Lishkat HaGozis, next to the Beis HaMikdash, then the Rambam sees this as part of its role. Of course, we know, this week we're reading Parshas Shekolim, and we're going to be reading about the yearly taxation of the Jewish people. What was the shekel used for? Well, it was used for religious functioning, the carbon tomid, buying a share in the daily sacrifices which are offered on behalf of the whole Jewish people. But the Mishnah in Shekolim tells us this was also used to collect money for the repairing of roads and the building of bridges and the fixing up of the highways after the winter has passed. So obviously part of the role of the central authority is the running of society. So the fact that the Rambam sees this as invested in the Sanhedrin is in a sense not such a chidush, not such a innovative idea, because of course you need central authority to run things. So this is either way what the Rambam says. The Rambam is of the view that this includes other things beyond that which we perhaps would narrowly think of as Torah normally. So this is the first first point in the Rambam. Now, what else? What other sources do we have around these ideas about what one should expect to get from rabbinical leadership? Should rabbinical leadership have insight to offer into matters of daily life? Should it, more than that, should it perhaps have authority over matters of daily life? So there are several Mishnayos and others that somewhat address this issue. And I want to discuss two Mishnayos. The first Mishnah, which we will get to later, is the very famous statement of Ben Bagbag. This is a Mishnah in Avos, in the 5th chapter of Avos, Mishnah 23. And the Mishnah says, Ben Bagbag Omer, the unusually named Ben Bagbag says, Hafochba v'hafochba dekula be'ba. Turn it over and over, because everything is in it. What is this Mishnah referring to? Turn it over and over, turn the Torah over and over, explore it endlessly, because everything is in it. And this is oft cited as a source for everything being included in the Torah, all knowledge being included in the Torah. Hafachba v'hafachba, turn it over endlessly, because you will find all knowledge there. Now, there is no doubt that there are those that indeed read this Mishnah in this way. For example, there is a Maharsha who is of the opinion that the Mishnah is telling us that correctly learned Torah gives insight into all wisdoms, gives insight into all that is to be known about the world. Others don't learn this Mishnah. For example, the Sufana on the Mishnah understands the everything in the Mishnah, turn it over and over because everything is to be found there, meaning everything of Torah, everything of belief, all the arguments and intellectual ideas that can be found around ruchnius, spirituality, and eternity, and immortality of the soul, and everything that we are meant to achieve spiritually should be found there. In other words, the Mishnah is telling us, kulaba, everything is there. Don't think that you need to search in other sources, the works of the philosophers, the works of thinkers of other faiths, for spiritual truth. No, everything that you could want in terms of your spiritual quest for meaning and purpose and insight is to be found in the Torah. But the Mishnah is referring to matters of spirit, not physical and material matters. So how to interpret the Mishnah is a source of debate. Now, there are several points to make about this. The first point is to say that even according to the reading of the Mishnah that says that all insight and all wisdom can be found there, it doesn't mean that we humans always have access and perfect access to this. Indeed, the Gemara is explicit about Amoraim going to learn from herdsmen how animals work in order to paskin aspects of the laws of Trefus. The Gemara is explicit about debates between Chachamim, the Chazal, the Chachamim Talmud, and the Chachamim Umas Ha'olam, the scholars and scientists, probably referring to the Greeks of the secular world, about astronomical matters. And the Gemara tells us that on occasion, Chazal admitted that the Chachamim Umas Ha'olam, the sages of the world, had understood the scientific matters better than they had. And indeed, the Rambam says the reason this was included in the Gemara is to teach us the ways of the wise, who accept wisdom and insight from anyone who has them, so that we should realize that when it comes to matters of science, we need to turn to the scientists. So even though the Mishnah, according to some readings, is telling us that in principle all science or wisdom can be accessed through Torah, through the mysteries of Torah, it doesn't mean to say that this is always accessible, or indeed that this is the always the natural way to approach it. And this seems explicit in the Gemara that this isn't the case, that it's always accessible. So the Mishnah, in fact, doesn't tell us, it's not a source for rabbinic authority in matters of, or all matters, or matters of science, or matters of other economics, or other such fields. It's simply telling us that perhaps, according to one reading, that in theory, if one delves in the Torah, one can access everything. It isn't telling us that there's authority granted over this, meaning if it turns out, if factually speaking this is correct, then it's correct, and if factually speaking it's not, it's not. It's not a question of authority, it's a question of, does one have this or not? Is this correct or wrong? And as I said, probably the simplest reading in the Mishnah, as per the Zifana and others, is it means in matters of spirituality. So this is one Mishnah, the Mishnah of Hafochba in the 5th chapter of Avos. There is another semi-Mishnah in the 6th chapter of Avos. And the reason I call it a semi-Mishnah is because even though we are used to thinking of Avos as having 6 chapters, and we read it on Shabbos Mincha in summer months with a 6-chaptered work, of course, the first 5 chapters of Avos are the Mishnah of Avos, and the 6th chapter is a non-Mishnaic work. It's a brisa. It's a collection of sayings of the Tanoim, of the Mishnaic era rabbis, that was never edited into the Mishnah, but was collated at some other time or by some other person, presumably one of the other collators like Rabbi of Tanaitic statements. It's what we call a brisa, an external source of Tanaitic statements, and it was appended onto Avos as a 6th chapter because it deals with similar themes. But either way, it's certainly a very authoritative text in terms of transmitting to us the language, or the knowledge and insight and statements of the Tanoim, the Rabbonim from the Mishnah. And the very first Mishnah in the 6th non-Mishnaic chapter of Avos reads as follows. In fact, maybe I'll just share the screen with you so that you can see this source inside. And it begins, Shalu Chachamim B'Loshen HaMishnah. The sages taught in the language of the Mishnah. So in other words, this is not a Mishnah, but they taught in the language of the Mishnah. This is a brisa written in the language of the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer, Rabbi Meir says, Kol ha'osek b'Torah lishma, zocher l'devarim harbe. Someone who learns Torah lishma merits many things. And then he lists later on in the Mishnah qualities, or hopefully qualities, of a Talmud Chacham, of a Torah scholar. And we'll just go through the list. Nikra Reya, Ohov, Ogus, Hamakam, Ogus, Abrias. It lists all the qualities that such a person is beloved, loves God, loves humankind, all the qualities that a Talmud Chacham who learns Torah Lishma has or should have. And then he says at the top of the next page, I'll highlight this, and people benefit from such a Torah scholar. They benefit and gain wisdom, insight, knowledge, understanding, strength, consultation, advice. So the Mishnah here clearly says that a Torah scholar who learns Torah well should be a source of sound advice and insight and wisdom and counsel. So this Mishnah is a source that one would expect from a Talmud Chacham, insight and wisdom into other areas of life. And this is explicit in the commentaries, that here the Mishnah doesn't just mean matters spiritual, but even means matters material. So for example, the Meiri says, the people learn from a Talmud Chacham, benefit from a Talmud Chacham, how to behave in areas of material prosperity and material success. So this is a very clear source that one would expect to benefit such from a Talmud Chacham. And in the commentary of the Abar Benel to Avos, he says similarly, he speaks at great length about a wise person who has learns Torah knowledge One should be able to benefit from them in economics, in finance, in military matters, and so on and so forth. Indeed, Abarbanel is a case in point. He was a Torah leader. He was also a statesman and a diplomat, and till his expulsion from Portugal, from Spain, Portugal, the tragic expulsion, had mixed in the higher circles and was renowned for his wisdom and insight into many areas of life. So there's no doubt that this is a quality that a Talmud Chacham should possess, and that this is what this Mishnah is saying. But again, I don't think the Mishnah is a source for particular authority in this matter. I don't think the Mishnah is saying that there's absolute, that the Talmud Chacham has authority in the matter. It says, Minehenin mimenu, one benefits from one, and one would expect this to be the case, meaning one should be able to go to a Talmud Chacham and expect them to be able to help one understand and achieve insight. Hopefully, Torah gives one understanding and wisdom to help one assess situations and deal with them properly. And indeed, people who know renowned Talmidei Chachamim know that they can speak to them, and it's a very helpful process in getting deeper and better understanding in a vast range of areas, because hopefully the Talmud Chacham has been well trained how to analyze and assess situations and deal with them. And this is part of Torah Lishma, is hopefully it gives one some of that insight. But again, it isn't claiming here authority, it's simply saying that one can benefit from such a person if one chooses to avail oneself of that. Indeed, there are strong trends of criticism over the idea that this should be one's primary relationship to Talmidei Chachamim. And here I want to share a very remarkable and interesting source from no less a figure than the Baal HaTanya. The Baal HaTanya is Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi. He was the founding teacher of the Chabad movement, which later developed into Lubavitch. He was a second generation student of the Baal Shem Tov, and he was a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, who in turn was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. And interestingly, whilst Hasidus and Chabad have become associated with the idea of turning to the Rebbe, the Hasidic Rebbe, for insight into every area of wisdom and how to live one's life, the Baal HaTanya, at least in this particular letter, is very critical of this idea. And there's a lot of discussion in Chabad Hasidus about whether he later changed his mind or not, and how to reconcile current Chabad practice with asking the Rebbe everything. Certainly in his life, that was Hasidic practice and Chabad practice, and even after his death, using various dubious mystical means, continuing to do so in some branches and some elements of Chabad, not all of them, of course. But the founding Chabad Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad Hasidus, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who I should mention was an exceptionally prominent and important rabbinic leader, not just in the Chabad world, but for all of us. He wrote one of the most significant halachic works of all time, the Shulchan Aruch. He's a figure to be taken exceptionally seriously, whether one learns Tanya or not, whether one is a follower of the sort of Hasidic and philosophical thinking that he put forward, but a very, very important thinker. And he wrote and published a vast array of letters. Some of these were private letters, and some of these were public calls to action or policy statements in which they were addressed to his scattered followers and Hasidim throughout that part of the world in which they lived, of East Europe in which they lived. And in one particular letter, a very famous letter, letter 22, in fact, I'll share the screen just to have a little look at this letter. He says as follows, Ohuvai, Achai V'reya, my beloved brethren and friends. He says, I'm now going to give you Techacha Musa, a bit of rebuke based upon my hidden love. So I'm going to give you words of open rebuke, but realize they are coming from a place of love. Let us come and debate. Look back at what happened in history. Was there ever such practice in the days of old? Have we ever found a source in any of the works of the Rishonim or the Achronim to be a practice and a normal way of behaving, to ask for physical advice, conduct in guidance what to do, but in matters of the physical world. Even the great Gedolim of Israel, the early ones who were like the Tanaim and Amoraim, honestly, who that no secret was hidden from them, the paths of the heaven were open to them. So he's citing various sources in Chazal that indicate that no secret is hidden from them, unlike later generations, Kim Nevi'im, Mamish, or even, but only for the actual prophets, like the prophet Samuel. So he says, even the great Amoraim, Tanaim, Rishonim, we don't find people asking them about physical matters of physical success. Only the Nevi'im, like the story with Shmuel. So here he's referencing a story in Shmuel in which Shaul, pre his coronation, loses his donkey, his mule, his ass, and he goes and searches for it, and then is told that the Choser, the Novi, the prophet, Shmuel is in town, and he goes to Shmuel to ask where is the donkey that is lost. And Shmuel, instead of just responding to him, tells Shaul, you are destined to be the future king. So this is a story which we're not going to go into now, but there we find someone turning to a spiritual leader for matters of material insight. Says the Baal HaTanya, who, as I said, is really a exceptionally senior Torah authority. We've never heard in the history of Klal Yisrael, post the prophetic era, that anyone does such a thing. Not with the Amoraim, the Tanaim, who knew everything, not with the Rishonim, not with the Achronim. Look at the clear and well-established minhag. This simply isn't the way people behave. And then he carries on, all the affairs of people, other than Torah itself, is only found through prophecy. He quotes the pasuk, it is not to the wise bread. If you expect all wise people to flourish financially, sadly that's not the case. Like the sages tell us, etc. And then he carries on. What about the Ne'enin Mimenu Eitzah Tushia, this Mishnah that we just saw in Ovus, that one benefits from them Eitzah or Tushia, wise advice? Well, he says even more than we accept. Hainu b'divrei Torah, this is referring to divrei Torah. This doesn't refer to matters of material success. The advice and the benefit and the wisdom we can achieve from Zamin Chachamim should be matters of Torah. And then he finishes off. We're not going to go through the whole letter. I will tell the truth to those who listen to me. Love sometimes sometimes breaks boundaries. And the reason why you are not understanding this is because of your great love for physical affairs. You love your physical lives, your material lives so much that therefore this is what you seek from your rabbinic leaderships, but this is not correct. Etc. This isn't the way to behave. What you should seek from the rabbinic leadership is spiritual guidance, not physical guidance, not guidance about matters of physical life. Now, the Baal HaTanya may or may not have changed his mind. It is possible that he changed his mind. Certainly the practice in Chabad Chasidus is to go to the rabbinic leadership for everything. And it may be that the Baal HaTanya eventually bowed effectively to pressure, and he understood this is what his followers wanted from him and needed from him, and therefore as a matter of rabbinic practice, decided to start offering material life and material advice, and certainly this was the practice of his successors. And it may be he held this was the right thing to do. In other words, his words of rebuke were ignored. People did turn to rabbinic leadership for advice in other matters, and therefore it's appropriate for that to be offered. And I think to a degree this remains rabbinic practice to this day. So a good Rav should receive pastoral training and some level of therapeutic training, and should invest effort in being able to advise people on matters of medical matters and so on and so forth, to be able to signpost successfully, because the fact is that Rabbanim can operate in the role of mediators and signposters and support people, and hopefully Torah learning and wisdom has given the Rav the insight to do this. So in practice, people may choose to avail themselves of this aspect of rabbinic leadership, and there's no doubt this has become a common thing, both in Chabad and even beyond Chabad. But again, let's listen to what the Baal HaTanya tells us, because he tells us a few points. He first of all tells us that he is not aware of a single source in the Rishonim Achronim to say that this is what one ought to do. Perhaps one can choose to do it. He's not that happy that people are choosing to do it, but perhaps he also comes to accept it. But the idea that this is something that one has to do, not the view of the Baal HaTanya. He says there's no source of which he's aware. And the Baal HaTanya is a master of the whole literature of Torah. That doesn't mean to say there's no alternative view. There's always room for debate. But the idea that this is a must, the Baal HaTanya is sure this is not the consensus view. More than that, the Baal HaTanya says this was never the minhag. This was never the practice. He says, I'm not aware in history that this is how people behave. He says, remember what happened in the past. This isn't how people used to behave. Have we ever heard of such a thing before? So this isn't the minhag either. So the Baal HaTanya is saying the idea that we need to turn to rabbinic authority for all matters of material life, this isn't the way the practice used to be. So again, it seems to me that the classic sources are not claiming material authority over every aspect of life. Now, it is important, though, to make a distinction here, and this distinction is important. And 2 points need to be said. The first point, which someone actually posted to me absolutely correctly on the chat group, is presumably the Rambam sees a difference between statements of general approach and individual questions, e.g., should I enter this business or not? And this point is absolutely correct. And I want to say this point both ways round. So first of all, I'll say it in the Rambam. The Rambam, who speaks about rabbinic authorities applying to tikkun olam, not just to inyonei hadat, matters of faith, but also tikkun olam, also matters pertaining to perfecting the world. And the Rambam does grant this authority to the Sanhedrin, the chazek hadas l'takin olam, to strengthen the faith and to fix the world, is presumably talking about matters of communal and public policy. We gave the example of running the road systems and taxing to pay for the repair of bridges and highways after the winter and the like. This would be the authority. He isn't suggesting that a rabbinic authority should be used to get advice about a particular matter of health or finance or business or marriage or whatever it may be. So that's the first point. Similarly, the Baal HaTanya, who criticizes his Hasidim who are turning for him for advice in matters material, doesn't mean to say that rabbinic authority shouldn't be over matters of public policy. He's talking about individuals who are coming to see him about matters of personal advice, as an example, should I enter this business or not? He isn't saying that there isn't a leadership role for matters of general policy. And indeed, we know this for a fact historically, that when it came to matters of general policy, indeed, this was the practice throughout the generations, when there was a need and availability of leadership, and when Jews had authority. For example, in East Europe, for several hundred years, the Vad Arba Harotzos, the Committee of Four Lands, used to meet, and this Committee of Four Lands would decree matters of public policy and communal running. In other words, the so-called Council of Four Lands was granted a level of authority to run Jewish affairs. Jewish communities had a level of autonomy. We're talking here from the late 1500s, 1580s, and so through to the late 1700s, 1760s, so roughly a period of probably about 200 years, and was given authority in Polish Jewish life to run affairs. It was known as the Wad Arba Arotzes because it included 4 Arotzes, 4 regions: Greater Poland, Little Poland, Galicia, and so on. And it used to run matters of Jewish affairs. Now, even there, interestingly, even though we don't know exactly how it used to work, it definitely included representatives of the lay leadership of the people. Well, as far as we understand, each community was elected to the Vard, to the council, from each kahal, each collection of communities, and to them were added 6 leading rabbonim of Poland. So even there, the authority was shared between lay and rabbinic leadership. There were probably something like 15 to 25 leaders, delegates rather, of which 6 were rabbinic, and the remaining 10 to 20 were lay leadership. So certainly, and of course, there should be rabbinic voice in communal decisions, but not necessarily beyond that. Someone wrote to me correctly, doesn't repairing the roads arise in the narrow context of the pilgrimage to Yerushalayim, of Aliyah Regel, and the need to go to Yerushalayim? Yes and no. Of course, there's a religious element to it, but it's also the general running of the country. However, it's true that more generally, the running of the country was the authority of the Melech, the king, rather than the Sanhedrin. So this is the first point I wanted to make, a distinction between public policy and private policy, and this cuts both ways. The Rambam, who says there is rabbinic authority, is presumably, it sounds like he's talking only about public policy, and the Baal HaTanya, who says that this isn't the appropriate thing to turn to Rabbanim for, is presumably talking about private and personal advice. Having said that, and after having said anything, I'm not absolutely convinced that the Chazon Ish that we started off with many weeks back, who gave a very maximalist version of Das Torah, would necessarily disagree with what we're saying. And this brings out part of the difficulty of vocabulary over here. Because Chazon Ish says that the division between Issa v'Heta on the one hand and guidance in everyday life on the other is a non-kosher division. This is completely incorrect. But what exactly does the Chazon Ish mean? Does he mean that therefore one should be turning to Rabbonim for every aspect of life and every decision one's making? Or does he mean simply that rabbinic authority isn't over classically what we might understand as Issa v'Heta, as pots and pans and treifas shilas? After all, clearly there are halachic and spiritual factors to take into account around many material and olam hazeh, this worldly decisions. So for example, one comes to choose a job. So there are halachic factors and spiritual factors that should be taken into account. And it makes sense to speak to a Talmid Chacham or a Rav about this before so doing. Who might help one decide which job to choose? Well, clearly one's own interests would be an element. Clearly, perhaps a career guidance person who knows about the pros and cons of different jobs would be relevant. But then there may well be, and perhaps always would be, certain spiritual factors to take into account. The jobs which pose greater spiritual dilemmas and greater potential clashes of spiritual life, and the jobs that pose less. This could be jobs that quite literally involve clashes because the nature of the work regime means that it's difficult to get out early on a Friday, it's difficult to get Shabbos off, it's difficult to get to minyan, or it could be jobs where there's more spiritual conflicts and more moral dilemmas that one would find oneself in than in other jobs. It could be jobs where the nature of the career is about more superficial, more around the external than the internal. It could be jobs in which there's pressures to shift morality, and there could be jobs where the workload is so long by the time one travels into Canary Wharf and back every day, one's just simply never able to be with one's family and see them, and one's working from 6 till 11 every night. So it's certainly reasonable to discuss the spiritual and moral implications. There could be jobs that are quite simply also for a frum and Jew who cares about halacha to engage in because they involve promiscuity or other things which are inappropriate. So even with the Chazon Ish, it's not clear what the Chazon Ish exactly means when he says that this distinction between Issa v'Heter and other matters is an invalid one. It may well be that the Chazon Ish means don't just think of speaking to your Rav when you have a question about a pot and a pan, realize there's other dimensions to life. Similarly, when it comes to marriage, again, obviously there are aspects which are not rabbinic, and people need to know their own personalities and relationships and what is appropriate for them and so on and so forth. But again, there may be spiritual questions around this. After all, entering into a life partnership is a significant, perhaps the most significant choice we ever make, and having a partner in life, a spouse in life, who shares one's values and visions can make an enormous difference to one's spiritual life. And therefore, again, one could imagine scenarios in which it would be appropriate to ask questions about how to balance different competing psychological or relationship elements and matters of hashkafa or halacha, where one finds oneself perhaps drawn and attracted and connected on some levels, but on other levels having concerns about the spiritual implications. And similarly with medical treatment and the like. So I'm not going to belabor the point, other than to say that, again, we are reminded of the spectrum over here, of the idea that the part of the problem in this complication is that Torah is used as a catch-all phrase when perhaps we need to be more nuanced about it. And in this series, I've been attempting to show the subtleties of the sources and really try and treat it as a sugya and see actually what the classic source is saying, rather than descending into sort of politics and polemics around the divisions between different sectors of the Jewish world. And it seems that one can make a statement, but the statement can be taken or drawn or extended out of context. And it shouldn't be controversial to say that halacha and hashkafa don't just apply to pots and pans and kashrus and issa v'heter, but also apply to other areas of material life. But there's a far gap between that and therefore thinking that every decision is one that needs rabbinic sign-off and approval on, or indeed that the rabbinic psak or advice should be the only factor taken into account. Clearly, in the examples I gave, when it comes to choosing a job or choosing a spouse, one element of making a good decision would be the spiritual advice that one is offered. One element of the decision would be the impact on spiritual life, and that should be an important element of the decision, but then it needs to be balanced. Unless it's black and white, this is something that's asa, it would need to be balanced with other factors. It wouldn't be the only factor that one would take into account. One would also need to take into account other elements that are personal and subjective and individual and perhaps only knowable to the questioner themselves in terms of which sort of career or spouse would make a good one. So this is a nuance, a subtlety around this, that we need to be careful about some of the statements that are made to understand actually what they mean in context. Now, someone wrote to me in the chat, and I'll finish off with this point because this is another example of this. When it comes to military matters, similarly, clearly halacha has what to say about this. So in the classic halachic system, the king would make the decision whether to go to war, but then it would have to be signed off by the Sanhedrin. And this is because war clearly has a military aspect to it. What is militarily the best strategy and the best way of doing this? And as a moral and spiritual aspect to it, is this morally the right or the wrong thing to do? It is a war that's appropriate to not. And even within the strategy itself, there may be a spiritual or halachic element to this. How do I balance competing risks? Do I engage in a more risky strategy that could close the issue militarily quicker, or a less risky strategy that could take longer? How do I balance competing lives? Can I risk one unit in order to save many units? So of course, there's again relevant halachically to this. And the question wrote in the Times of Revolt against Rome, the Chazal spoke against the Zealots and advised them not to fight, and yet we see 60 years later Rabbi Kiva supporting Bar Kochba in his revolt, which led to disaster. And he's saying, he's making an observation, which is that sometimes, a very, very excellent observation, sometimes the rabbinic decision in these areas proves correct and sometimes not correct, and there isn't a claim of rabbinic infallibility over here. So finally, I'm being asked of you is the distinction between offering helpful advice and telling a person what they should do. And that is one of the distinctions I'm making, but not the only distinction. There's a distinction between advice and psak, absolutely. However, it could be in material matters, psak is relevant. A Rav would be entitled to say, as a matter of psak, I believe this job is forbidden, this job is also. We could conceive of jobs which would be in conflict with halacha, and a Rav would be entitled to give a psak. This is simply an osur, forbidden job to go into. I'm simply saying that one needs to know when is psak applicable and when isn't it applicable, and similarly in the realm of advice, when is advice applicable and when isn't it, both in terms of the breadth of the advice and in terms of the breadth of authority that is granted. So I hope that gives us more nuance and subtlety in terms of the range and breadth of Das Torah. We've seen different language in the Rishonim, and we've seen the Meiri and the Abarbanel, for example, who translate the Mishnah of Eitzah to Shia, of the advice one gets from a Talmud Chacham as referring to matters of material success. We've seen fascinatingly the Baal HaTanya who says, no, the Mishnah never meant that. It meant matters of spiritual success and failure. And we've then seen different ways of posing this, but actually the degree to which these classic sources disagree are not clear to me. I'm not aware of a classic source that grants rabbinic infallibility in the most extreme way to all matters of material. Next week, in Mi'at Hashem, we will move on from this aspect of Das Torah and try and conclude the topic to look at what the role of Siyata Dishmaya, Ruach HaKodesh, modern day prophecy has to play in decision making, rabbinic decision making. And I was asked about this on the chat a while back and I addressed it briefly, but I think it deserves a greater look at. And also I've been asked to address how do we choose our Gedolim, who is a Godel, what qualifies one for a Godel, and I'll try and do that next week. But for now, I will stop for today. I'm not actually giving my 10 o'clock share today, my Gemara share, because we started a new Sugin Gemara. So those who want to remain on and ask extra questions, I'm happy just to hang around for a few minutes.